Hey, Daniel, how's it going? Mic check.
Hey, doing well. Can you hear me?
Yep. Are we going to have the
Great.
main account in here or anyone else from the team joining?
Give me 1 second. Let me just confirm. But yes, I believe so.
And also, Daniel, no worries at all. I was just checking. If they join, they join. If they don't, all good. I do want to get started here. So, good afternoon, Whale Coin Talk community. Welcome to the second AMA of the day. We had Oasis Network on earlier, and now we have Daniel from Arbitrum on. Daniel, before we get started, you want to give us a quick background of yourself, your career history, and how you started working in the crypto industry?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we'll have AJ joining from the business side any minute. Yeah, so my name's Daniel. And excuse me. So I've been at Off-Chain Labs slash Arbitrum since like early 2020, more or less. So not one of the founders, but one of the early members. Um, prior to Arbitrum, I was sort of involved in the crypto space in various ways and kind of got interested in like the world of layer two scaling. Initially, sort of on the research side. I have a background as an engineer. Was sort of actually initially interested in Lightning Network and Bitcoin, and kind of discovered the world of Ethereum layer two and realized a lot more was possible. And that's sort of the initial like gateway drug for me into Ethereum. And yeah, it was just really kind of blown away and impressed even at the beginning of 2020 by what the Off-Chain Labs folks had already done at that point. So definitely wanted to be a part of it. And yeah, with Arbitrum, I do sort of a mix of engineering stuff, particularly on the smart contract level, as well as kind of like technical research, documentation, communication, things of that nature. So various things on the tech side. And I think I see AJ joining, but he's still a listener. Um, so we'll have to sort that out. But yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for the intro, Daniel. And it looks like AJ's buffering, trying to get him up soon here, but here. Yeah.
Hey, I'm here.
Yep. Right on. AJ, welcome. Before we get started, I did the same thing with Daniel. Give us a quick background of yourself and how you started working in the crypto industry.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having us on. I'm AJ, Chief Strategy Officer at Off-Chain Labs, the team developing the Arbitrum protocol. Been in crypto personally since about 2014. Back then, it was basically Bitcoin and shitcoins. Ethereum launched obviously in 2015. Got super excited about that. Became extremely passionate about what the opportunities could be. Um, that was like my personal life, more of like sort of like my career focus. I went to law school. I was actually a real estate lawyer until about 2020, but was doing some crypto law things sort of on the side. I was actually working with the Off-Chain Labs team, and and then basically when they launched on testnet, Stephen reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in joining in a business development and partnerships capacity, and I just quit my job. It was like don't regret it at all. Basically, it's been awesome, but definitely a little bit of a career pivot at that point for me, for sure.
Beautiful. And here we are. Guys, I want to jump right into Arbitrum. I'm assuming you'll be tag teaming this AMA. In your own words, can you explain to the audience what Arbitrum is? Give us a breakdown of the distinguishing tech. And also, I want to talk a bit about how it stands out with respect to other popular layer 2 solutions. Metis, Optimism. I know that Polygon is technically a side chain, but would love to have a little bit of contrast drawn between each of those three because they're so popular.
Sure. So I can take an initial stab here, but
There you
I
go.
would say so. Arbitrum is a well, suite of technologies, but it's essentially an Ethereum layer 2. Short version of what that means is it's a chain where you can do Ethereum stuff, but cheaper and faster. When we say it's a layer 2, you know, Arbitrum rollup, sort of the core product of Arbitrum, what we mean is that the sort of first key property is that it sort of at the protocol level in principle inherits its security directly from Ethereum. We could quibble about some of these terms, but that's the basic idea, is you get sort of the same security assumptions of using Ethereum itself. So that's what defines it as a layer 2, which, as you said, there's other, you know, side chains and things like that are different. In terms of beyond that, the defining features of Arbitrum, sort of the key target for us has been Ethereum compatibility or EVM compatibility, which just basically means that from a sort of technical standpoint at the lowest level, all the way up from a user standpoint at the highest level, the experience of using Arbitrum, we try to make it as close to that of using Ethereum as possible, except again, cheaper and faster. So that means from a development perspective, if you're a smart contract developer, everything will be kind of familiar. If you're a user, you can use the same wallets, developers can use the same tooling, even other bits of infrastructure like indexing services and block explorers kind of work out of the box on Arbitrum or as close to out of the box as possible. So yeah, so Ethereum compatibility and security are sort of the two kind of necessary pieces. So yeah, that's Arbitrum rollup. I should say we have two chains on mainnet now. So there's Arbitrum 1, which is an Arbitrum rollup, which is sort of what I was just describing. And then we have Arbitrum Nova as well, which I think we'll talk a bit about today, which sort of makes a different trade-off on the sort of security and fees spectrum or dimension, or I guess like plane, where essentially it introduces a bit of a security assumption, a trust assumption, but you can get lower fees, in fact, significantly lower fees. So we sort of encourage projects doing things like social media, gaming, and things like that. Arbitrum Nova might make more sense. But yeah, I think that's my initial pitch. Anything else you want to add to that, AJ?
Not on the technical side, no.
Cool. So I understand that I think Midas was a hard fork of Optimism, if I'm not mistaken. And I know that the main difference between Optimism, or one of the main differences between Optimism and Arbitrum, are the fraud proof function. So Optimism uses single round, and Arbitrum uses a multi-round fraud proof. Can you explain the differences between those two, please, Daniel?
Sure. So I can explain the difference, but maybe the more important thing to say first is that was sort of Optimism's initial design was to use single round fraud proofs. They've changed to a system to use multi-round fraud proofs. So I would say if you look at the trajectory of Optimism and the trajectory of Arbitrum, you know, their system now, their target of their system looks a lot more like Arbitrum than it used to. I think is a fairly fair and diplomatic way to say it. But basically the idea here, so in both cases with optimistic rollup, the idea here is the optimistic part means you, from the perspective of somebody running a node, an Arbitrum node, you can kind of, or rather, let's put it this way, from the perspective of Ethereum itself, Ethereum isn't validating what's going on Arbitrum. It can kind of optimistically assume it's valid. And then only if absolutely necessary do we prove if something invalid happens. So it's sort of innocent until proven guilty, as opposed to validating everything all the time, is I think maybe a nice analogy here. So the way this idea of proving something invalid, this is where fraud proofs come in. This is where it gets a little bit technical and wonky, but I can say, like, sort of the question here is if something invalid goes on, so an Arbitrum validator makes a claim that isn't really true, there's this question of how exactly do you prove that on layer 1? And with optimistic rollup, you have to do some of the work that you were optimistically assuming was valid, now you have to actually do. And basically what the Arbitrum model has been is it's sort of this interactive game where you can imagine if two validators disagree, two Arbitrum validators, what they're kind of doing is narrowing down their disagreement into sort of as minimal and concise a step as possible, literally one computational step. And then that sort of gets executed on layer 1, and that's the fraud proof. So there's kind of these two steps. One, we have to figure out where we disagree, and then we execute a very simple thing. the initial version of Optimism, their target was to sort of do this work of proving fraud in a single step. And what that kind of means is you have to do something that's more like actual execution. So you have these layer 2 transactions that happen on layer 2, and then you kind of have to recreate it at layer 1. And there's various pros and cons to these approaches, but I think I don't want to speak for the Optimism team, but the sense I get is what they found is the single round having to sort of really emulate the full execution on layer 1 ended up being sort of fairly complicated and maybe prohibitively complicated. And I think also for reasons that are maybe a bit out of scope here, it's that approach, it's a bit more limited in terms of the level of Ethereum compatibility you can get. So with multi-round fraud proofs, you can almost imagine like layer 1 doesn't actually have to do as much work, or it doesn't need to know as much. It just needs to be able to do this fairly simple thing. So that's a nice design. And yeah, so with Arbitrum, we have that, we have that fully implemented. So you can see in our code base, this game, this multi-round fraud proof game is all there. And it is live on mainnet. There are certain guardrails in place now, so it's not in its fully decentralized form, but everything that is sort of necessary for it to be in its decentralized form is implemented. And I won't go into our architecture beyond that. But I think with Optimism, they had a fairly maybe close to working implementation of the single round fraud proof, but then they decided for V2 to do the multi-round thing, which they're still working on.
Daniel, I'm not going to do it justice, but it might, if you would like, it might make sense to sort of talk a little bit about Stylus, just because it might be a big tech differentiator, or even philosophical differentiator moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is its own big topic, but I will give maybe the short version. So from the idea, what Stylus will mean, this is going to be a sort of upgrade to the Arbitrum virtual machine, to the Arbitrum tech stack. From the outside, what it will mean for users, or really for developers, is that we'll be able to support a lot more technology, particularly like additional programming languages for writing smart contracts. So you'll be able to do things like write smart contracts in Rust or Rust-based languages or C++. The reason that we're capable of doing this is the way the sort of fraud-proof system works on Arbitrum is sort of at the bottom level, at the machine level. We actually execute. This execution on layer 1 happens in WASM or WebAssembly, which is sort of this universal or fairly universal format that's supported pretty widely. The idea of using this, and credit to the Nitro team, particularly Lee, which was kind of his brainchild behind the current tech stack. But the idea here is we can sort of take the Ethereum code, which is written in Go, and if and when we need to fraud proof it, we can compile it down to WASM, and then that's where this kind of fraud proof game happens. So that was like, it's already a nice design. It gives a strong Ethereum compatibility. Where Stylus comes in is we can sort of take advantage of the fact that, okay, a lot of other stuff compiles down to WASM too. So we can sort of introduce these other languages, compile those down to WASM, and execute them as if they were EVM code, or as if they came from Solidity. Technically what's involved here is essentially there's a few things, right? There's the fact that we have this fraud prover. We have to sort of do things like manage gas at the WASM level and things like that. Maybe I just won't say more than that for now, because I'm not the best one to talk about it. But the sort of net result is, we can support a much wider suite of technologies. And also, if you do sort of develop smart contracts in this other way, this Stylus way, they will almost certainly be a lot cheaper than if you wrote them in Solidity and compiled them to EVM, cheaper in terms of gas costs. So it's sort of the idea is that, it won't sort of break the EVM in any way. If you're a Solidity developer, you don't have to learn any new stuff. But if you want to write in other languages, you can, which is cool because, maybe you want to write in other languages. Maybe if you're a Solidity developer, maybe you've thought to yourself, perhaps there's another language that I could use to write smart contracts, because there are things not ideal about Solidity. But it also means that you can get some real nice gas optimization. So yeah, keep an ear out for more news on Stylus.
And this full-fledged Stylus can be available, or is expected to be available sometime this year, or are you guys not able to really say?
Don't know if I can talk about timelines yet, but I would say, keep an ear out for that. I'm just not sure. But
I think we publicly said that our target is for it to be in 2023. We haven't committed to anything beyond that.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll be giving more info and more details just about the technology and everything fairly soon. So,
And you probably touched upon this a bit, but was wondering how Arbitrum approaches the blockchain trilemma, and also how it manages close to near zero gas fees without sacrificing network. Well, I guess it's not really sacrificing network security because it's using Ethereum security, but how exactly it approaches the blockchain trilemma is something that I'm curious about.
Sure. So I know there's like a few versions of the blockchain scaling trilemma. So let me know if this does or doesn't answer your question. But essentially, yeah, the sort of decentralization and trustlessness component, again, for Arbitrum rollup in particular, which is the still kind of, we think of as the core product. That's sort of the absolute starting point. The necessary condition is we're not going to sacrifice on that, right? So as you say, in terms of trustlessness, we inherit security directly from Ethereum. In terms of trustlessness and sort of decentralization, right? So basically, you know, the reason we can claim that is we have this core property which says, like, if fraud is committed, it can be proven, and the parties that can prove fraud, in principle, can be anybody. Anybody can run a validator, or will be able to run a validator once we're in a more sort of progressively decentralized form. In terms of like things like, let's say, so that's on the decentralization side. In terms of scalability, what is worth saying here is it doesn't exactly, and this is sort of generally true of layer 2. Layer 2 isn't inherently magical. So the things that the core scalability bottlenecks on layer 1, which I would say the biggest bottleneck is state growth on Ethereum. Moving stuff to layer 2 doesn't sort of inherently solve that problem or fix that problem, right? In other words, an Ethereum layer 1, we have to think about how fast the state is growing, what we're going to do about that. If we have an EVM compatible layer 2, the same is true, right? So Arbitrum state can and does grow, and that's something we need to consider. What I would say though is that, you know, all of the, essentially, because we're sort of very much in line with Geth and with the EVM, all of the research, all of the thinking, whether it's, you know, different versions of state rent or history expiry and all of that, we sort of follow and contribute to. And there might even be a world where some of that stuff gets tried out on layer 2 before it does on layer 1. So it's not a magic bullet, but we can sort of use those same approaches. What I would also say, the thing that is sort of inherently useful about layer 2 is what it does is it like separates the state. So instead of us all using the same state at layer 1, if we're using a bunch of different layer 2s, you have these sort of opt-in environments that don't sort of offload this burden to the whole system, just to sort of subsections of it. Yeah, I think I covered 2 of 3 things. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. What would the third thing in the trilemma be in this case, if I covered decentralization and scaling? Security, yeah. So right. So security, decentralization. I would. This is why I said there's like slightly different version of the trilemma, but I would sort of like lump them together here. We derive security from Ethereum, and that's just another way of saying that Arbitrum is, in principle, fully decentralized. Yeah, Arbitrum roll.
So bringing it back to that comparison question, do you guys believe that when it comes to layer 2s, it has to be a zero-sum game, or do you think that the more layer 2s there are, the better, the more it helps each one of them scale? It's kind of this symbiotic relationship between all of them.
I'm curious what you think, AJ. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that I have a couple of thoughts here. I don't think it's too crazy, but I'm curious for Daniel your thoughts too. Or basically, the way I see it is we are extremely early, sort of in Ethereum's evolution of using layer 2 rollup technology for the purpose of scaling Ethereum, and you know, coupled with that, there's this new idea of you know, modular blockchain architectures as well, which people are thinking about now, which we kind of plug into, for example, on the Nova chain with our data availability committee. The way I see it is there will probably be a few standards that are established in the tech stack, and there will be multiple roll-up implementations of each tech standard, and they'll be optimized, you know, for different things. Like, you know, you can, for example, build, you know, a ZK stack that is super optimized for payments, kind of like, for example, ZK Sync V1. And then you'll have general smart contract platforms that have like all the capability of different languages that you use an optimistic rollup for that ZK architecture might not be able to do, or would be extremely prohibitively expensive to do. And I think that's kind of how the world will evolve. The secret, and Daniel kind of touched on it earlier, is that like one rollup environment cannot do that much to scale in Ethereum because you still have state bloat on the layer 2. But in parallel, many rollups can scale Ethereum meaningfully. So, like for example, you and your audience might not be familiar, or maybe familiar with the L2beat.com website. They have all of this activity about like what's happening on layer 2 versus layer 1. Right now, like layer 2 is doing 2.7 times as much traffic as layer 1. That number can scale significantly over tens or dozens of rollups. That doesn't scale over one or two rollups. So I think that the future of what it looks like for Arbitrum, the future of what it looks like for rollup technologies are, you'll probably see multiple implementations. And the reason I say it's early is because obviously there's a few players, Arbitrum included, that are first to market, have a lot of market share, but there's a lot of teams that have a lot of amazing engineering talent, a lot of resources and funding that are continuing to building out their technology. So it's early in the race. We're very proud, obviously, of Arbitrum's adoption as a stack. More than 50% market share of roll-up technology is on Arbitrum today. But I do imagine, both from what the tech stacks look like, how it gets adopted across multiple implementations. It's still early, but that's kind of how I imagine it playing out. It's hard to see. It's hard to see it all converging to one because different stacks be optimized for different things, and it's hard to see, this all being determined in, anytime soon. I would say it's like a final winner.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that, and I think in terms of the layer 2 ecosystem, there's kind of there's kind of the hypothetical of what would make the most sense to happen, and what would like sort of be best for users in the ecosystem at large versus what's like actually happening and most likely to happen are not exactly the same thing. I still think that it would be very valuable for their, obviously I think fully EVM compatible, or even more general, just like smart contract, state machine L2s are valuable, and maybe the most important part of the layer 2 ecosystem, which is why I work on Arbitrum. But I also think it would be very valuable to have more sort of application specific or use case specific blockchains, just because in those cases you can make them much more performant actually than something that's a full-fledged virtual machine. So a world where you sort of have your you have your layer 2s that can sort of support full functionality, and then you have these other app specific chains. Maybe those even run like on top of layer 2s as layer 3s, and users kind of move between them, and then a lot of the work that the ecosystem does is making that UX nice and smooth. That would kind of be the best world. But yeah, so things like AJ said, things that are focused on payments, things that are focused on privacy, even things focused on a particular type of app like a DEX. That I sort of hope that long term that's what we see, because that's just sort of like the best use of the tech. It seems like the trend is sort of kind of going in the other direction in a lot of ways, in that I was sort of disappointed to see what happened to Starkware's DYDX, and sort of disappointed to see Fuel V1 just not really being something that got traction. Fuel being just like a fully payment focused optimistic rollup thing. It seems like these teams, at least for now, the big sexy holy grail is EVM compatibility for all of them. So maybe that's just kind of where we're at. In that world, is it zero sum? Probably not. I think it's a bit more competitive, but in practice, I think one thing that's like surprised me over the past few years in the layer 2 world is just how much layer 2s themselves have their like network effects and have their like strong community effects. I think I kind of didn't expect that. I thought we would just see this stuff as infrastructure and it's all kind of part of Ethereum and people would use them. But no, it turns out, the same sort of community dynamics happen on layer 2s as layer 1. So even just from that alone, I can't imagine there being sort of one even EVM compatible rollup that consumes the rest. But yeah, I think the full smart contract stuff is inevitably a bit more competitive. But yeah, we'll see. We are definitely early, and I suspect over the next few years, this whole structure will change. And again, I hope to see other teams doing more focused app specific stuff, because I think that is useful.
Guys, Arbitrum and Optimism are today.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing? I
Yeah.
I was on mute.
Of course.
Can I just add something to that? Sorry. So yeah, one thing I just want to add to that is obviously, Arbitrum today, I referenced LTB earlier, has about 53% market share within sort of the layer 2 roll-up movement. But the thing is that we understand there are so many amazing teams that are, trying to help scale build out Ethereum. And it really pushes our team to continue in all facets of what we do to try and be the best that we can be, right? When we launched Arbitrum 1, within a week, like the Nitro code base, which increased throughput and decreased fees like by an order of magnitude, was being worked on already. I
think AJ might have gotten a call there or something.
Yeah, can you hear
something
me?
beeped.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry, yeah, somebody tried calling me. But Ethereum is scaling fees before. Now we're going to be scaling the developer experience. And all these are happening because we are pushing the envelope forward as much as we possibly can. And that's a function of the competition. And competition is a great thing. And the ability to have so many teams that are pushing to sort of have this holy grail of, trying to scale Ethereum makes us all better.
100%. I co-sign.
Yeah, I love that. And AJ, you mentioned 50%. I think even to this day, Arbitrum and Optimism remain the largest rollups. Do you think that they're going to face stiff competition when you have a cohort of new ZK EVMs popping up? I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with ZK EVMs, and would love to know what your thoughts are on those. You think and is Arbitrum developing its own ZK EVM?
Danny, do you want to start here, or?
Sure. Start. Arbitrum is not developing its own ZK EVM. I should say that up front. We paused a little after that. That wasn't because we are. So yeah, I mean, I can get my basic feeling here is, I mean, inevitably as the technology improves, as it clearly is, and as more teams emerge, there'll be more competition. And again, that competition is good. ZK EVM tech is very cool, and we do sort of follow what's going on in that world. Basically what I think though is that when it comes to ZK EVM, I remain a bit suspicious about a lot of the claims, particularly in terms of timelines, and particularly in terms of sort of what level of kind of EVM compatibility they can reach and when. A lot of people probably saw Vitalik had a nice post about the different sort of degrees, or he gives these different he assigns these different levels of EVM compatibility, and I think Arbitrum as it works today achieves like a very high degree of EVM compatibility, maybe about it seems almost as high as you could get while being while still being an actual L2, definitely close. For a ZK EVM to achieve that, I actually think is pretty far away, and I'm almost suspect as to whether it's even possible in principle, to be honest. That doesn't mean the tech isn't going to be useful and cool, but one thing that we've seen is that, and one thing I very much underestimated, to be honest, is how much even slight divergences with the EVM really do matter to teams. We mentioned, I think AJ mentioned that AJ mentioned we had this sort of classic to Nitro upgrade in was it just August? Yeah, I guess it was August. It feels like so long ago. But one of the big benefits of that change was, even though we could sort of, before that, we could say we were EVM compatible and sort of fully support it at the bytecode level, but with Nitro, we were sort of much closer in a lot of important ways in terms of how the actual node operates, because we were using Ethereum software more directly, in terms of how gas worked and things like that. And those little differences were actually the major sources of pain points that we had been getting before the Nitro upgrade. Things like gas, we were getting so much confusion, so many little questions. It was much more of a pain for developers than I expected. And I suspect that this is something that, again, the ZK EVM teams will see, that anytime they ask smart contract developers or again, infrastructure providers, node operators of saying, okay, here's the slate, here's the edge cases, here's the things you need to worry about, it does add this overhead of pain and friction. And again, I think just, as far as the competition goes, given where Arbitrum already is, that does put us in a place of a pretty strong advantage. And honestly, I think, there is also just a narrative out there that like ZK tech is kind of the, ultimately when it gets good enough, it's the end game, that it's just sort of strictly better than optimistic tech. And I actually don't believe that. I think the end game is, for scaling and for blockchains, is that like these two things are the key primitives, like validity proofs with ZK tech and like optimistic execution. There's always going to be a place for both. So I certainly don't see Arbitrum going away ever, as long as this technology is around, as long as crypto's around. Yeah, that's sort of how I see the current state of things.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction, because it does seem to me among a lot of different circles that there is this perception that ZK tech, once it becomes mature enough, is going to really just be the apex choice. I've heard Vitalik, not heard, but I've read Vitalik's quotes on ZK tech versus optimistic tech, but it does seem that the verdict is not out yet. So we'll stay tuned and see what happens over the next few years.
Yeah, and the other, I'll just say briefly, and it's not just in terms of beyond EVM compatibility, the other key factors are just like the overhead of proving and more particularly generating proofs is still huge. That will, that has decreased and it will continue to, because these teams are doing amazing research. But, you're not going to be no overhead ever. So it has to be very, very small in order for it to be a negligible factor. Meaning in optimistic rollups, there's no proof generation necessary in the optimistic case. So that's a key factor, and just the sheer complexity of it. I think that's a big and very difficult question, really, for a lot of dApps, and even for us, for NEL2, is, we're deploying these smart contracts. It's obviously very critical. They're managing a lot of funds. And we need to think about the chance that some vulnerability is discovered and what we would do in that case and things like that. It's a hard question in general. It's not like we're immune to it, but it becomes a lot trickier when you're dealing with something as complex as zero knowledge proofs. So I think that's going to be one of the big, a big reckoning, a big question that these teams have to face is what does it mean to truly decentralize a ZK EVM, and what sort of assurances can we really have in its security? So I think, yeah, these are all very important factors.
Guys, it seems like GMX played quite a crucial role in the growth of Arbitrum, at least from a TVL perspective. And I'm curious to know, and I'm looking at DeFiLlama now, it boasts almost a quarter of the total TVL. I'm curious to know what other native projects or major contributors you guys foresee or currently are aware of contributing towards the growth of Optimism of Arbitrum.
Daniel, I assume you want me to take this one.
I would love it if you took this one. Thank you.
Yeah. So obviously, first, I would like to give a sort of a shout out actually to all the builders, on the Arbitrum protocol. It's an amazing community of builders who've come together over the last year and a half. We're passionate about Ethereum scaling. We're passionate about trying to solve scaling without compromise. All the sort of things that we care about. In significant, and are investing our, professional, lives into trying to help solve. GMX was a great example of, being a project that, can only work on layer 2. If you look at like the amount of gas that's consumed, if it ever launched on layer 1, it would just be prohibitively expensive. It wouldn't have the ability to sort of function from an Oracle price update perspective, from just the amount of gas that it would take to open and close positions. It's designed really for non-Ethereum layer 1 tech stacks, and we work really closely with that. It was a very, very small team when we started working with, when I say working with them, being supportive of their efforts on Arbitrum, and there's a lot of teams like that. I would say what's really cool about what's going on, particularly in the DeFi ecosystem on Arbitrum, that it's coming together both Ethereum native projects, like the major sort of blue chips that everyone's aware of, like Uniswap, Aave, Sushi, Maker, etc., all sort of supporting Arbitrum today. And then Arbitrum native projects, in the early days, in DeFi in particular, GMX, Dopex, Mycelium, formerly TracerDAO, were probably some of the earliest Arbitrum native projects. And then obviously TreasureDAO on the gaming and NFT front has been a huge catalyst for ecosystem development and ecosystem growth, and a great team to work closely with in scaling Ethereum. But there's lately, actually, I would say, over the last 3 months, been another huge wave of like Arbitrum native specific projects, and I'm sure I'm going to leave folks out, but Camelot's launched an Arbitrum native. Dex recently has been getting a ton of traction. You have like the Vela Exchange team that launched recently, Rage Trade, Shell Protocol. I'm for sure leaving people out, so I'm not doing this any justice. The one thing I would say is what we've been seeing is a new wave also of projects coming from other ecosystems that want to expand. Trader Joe coming from Avalanche to Arbitrum was really exciting, as it's really a totally new community for them, and they've been very much embracing the Arbitrum Ethereum community. Gains Network expanded from Polygon into Arbitrum, and that was great. Arbitrum is doing, I think, about 70% of the volume for Gains, and they've been able to tap into the liquidity that lives on Arbitrum in a way that's incredible. Lyra has expanded as well from Optimism, so it's really cool to see sort of a convergence of Arbitrum-specific projects, Ethereum blue chips, and projects migrating from other ecosystems. What I would say is that one of the distinct factors I think about the Arbitrum ecosystem is it's a group of passionate builders who are really looking to collaborate. I think everyone from the Arbitrum ecosystem understands that it's extremely early in a market that is 7 billion people and providing financial services to 7 billion people, which is, if you think about sort of what the total addressable market of DeFi hypothetically is, and people are trying to build together. And GMX that you referenced is a great example of a project that has taken that approach and has always tried to remain collaborative with different teams that they're building with. And I think it's been to their success, to our success, and to the ecosystem success as a whole. So hope I didn't miss anyone. I'm sure I obviously did, because there's hundreds of projects building, but it's really the success and the growth of the Arbitrum ecosystem right now is really a credit to the teams building on top of the tech stack.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that you guys went from not so big. I mean, I knew about you guys a while ago, to all of a sudden everyone's an Arbitrum. Everyone is either trading or farming, or I know that you guys are trying to grow out Nova for gaming. Tell me a bit more about Nova and what the differences are between that and the Arbitrum One chain, and kind of the activity that you've seen develop over the course of its release.
Daniel, do you want to talk from a technical perspective first, and then I can talk about from like an ecosystem and product perspective?
Sure. So the key, there's kind of like one technical difference, but it's an important one. So if you're a developer and you look through the code base, you'll see most of the code that's used for Arbitrum One, or for Arbitrum rollup chains like Arbitrum One, or Arbitrum AnyTrust chains like Arbitrum Nova. Most of the code is the same. The key difference has to do with where we get the. It has to do with how data availability is handled. So we have this L2 blockchain. There's all these transactions, all these inputs going into it. And with something like Rollup, what we do is we sort of post that data directly on Ethereum layer 1, and this guarantees that it's available, so that again, if fraud is committed, we can do our fraud-proof game. So that's why we can claim that it's fully trustless. We sort of you're just inheriting, as long as Ethereum works as it's supposed to, all of this block data should be available. It should propagate. Which means that anybody can sort of, participate in these fraud-proof games. Because we're using layer 1 directly for data, that typically, if you look at, the cost of an Arbitrum transaction, that'll be the biggest contributor, is this raw data. So with Nova, like I said, everything kind of works the same way, except instead of sort of by default posting the data on layer 1, you sort of offload it to this committee, this data availability committee. And they sort of make this on-chain promise that they've witnessed the data, and essentially that they will make it available to whoever queries it. So the initial trust assumption there, again, is that the way it's set up, you're relying that at least 2 members of the committee are honest, meaning that they'll supply the data when necessary. As long as that holds true, then everything works as it would on a rollup. So yeah, that's the trade-off there is the trust assumption. The upside is all of this data stays off chain, which, like I said, that is the bulk of the fees that a user pays. So it's sort of like another level of optimistic ness. Instead of just optimistic execution on a rollup, we're sort of like optimistically keeping the data entirely off chain. So yeah, that's again cheaper with a slightly with a, you know, an additional security assumption. And then yeah, AJ, if you want to talk about the adoption we've seen.
Yeah. So one thing to add, you know, from a product perspective, we didn't like really focus on the gaming vertical before we launched Arbitrum Nova, because there's two issues, or issues is the wrong word, just, you know, features of a rollup that don't work well, great for the gaming vertical, that have, you know, a significant on-chain component. And the first is that because you post call data to layer one and you have to charge based on that, there's a lot of volatility in pricing. That volatility in pricing impacts a game's ability to sort of abstract gas usage from users, because they don't really have a great way to model how much it might cost them, you know, per user, because it's really external to the chain, external to the user base. It's a function of layer one. And the second is just generally posting call data to Ethereum is pretty expensive. So if a transaction might be, you know, let's say on Ethereum it's $5, on Arbitrum if you get it down to like, you know, 5 cents or 10 cents, that still might be too expensive for the nature of the action. And the trade-off between security and throughput might be justified depending on sort of the nature of what the significance and importance of what you're doing is. So the way we thought about it was introducing Nova, introducing a data availability committee. You don't post call data to Ethereum until the chain sort of falls back into a rollup mechanism. And that allows game developers to, you know, have a much better understanding of how much the user's transactions will cost, and if they want to extract it from the users, have the ability to do so. We've seen this play out with social gaming uses, and you know, the chain's been live about 5 months. So Reddit's launched their community points, and they've done some really cool stuff within the Reddit, you know, the cryptocurrency subreddit. You know, they're currently burning their token to buy ads within the Reddit subreddit, which I think is like super cool. They're building like these NFT murals. It's really early days for what like a community-owned subreddit could look like, but that's been a really exciting experiment. OpenSea launched their last month, which has allowed a lot of the games that we've been talking to on Arbitrum 1 to consider launching on Arbitrum Nova, and the Trove Marketplace has as well, which is part of Treasure now. So we've been getting a lot of the infrastructure that's necessary to make the decision between Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova easier, but principally we're recommending that games that have a high on-chain footprint should be using Nova, just because, you know, it might not be such an issue today if there's not significant gas spikes, but it will be an issue for games that launch on rollup technologies in the future if Ethereum layer one gas ever goes back to what it was. And you know, last week we had, during I think it was the Blur airdrop, the price of gas on layer one went up significantly, and you know, any game on a rollup that, you know, this is not an Arbitrum specific issue, this is like a rollup concept, right? Anything that's posting called into Ethereum, that game became 10 times more expensive to play from a transaction fee perspective, you know, while the Blur airdrop was happening. And you know, the ability to sort of abstract that, you know, in a way that doesn't compromise security as much as, you know, other architectures might, is really what's so exciting about the Nova chain. And we're pushing really hard for trying to get the right projects to launch on the right chains. You know, DeFi projects, we're not telling them to launch on Nova because, you know, you don't have to really go from, there's no real demand to go from, let's say, 7 cents to 1 cent, for example, on a DeFi product, because there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not, you know, including like liquidity and you know, slippage, etc., that go into where you would make a trade. So we're really trying to actually distinguish blockchain technology as a stack for the use cases that each one would need to utilize, and try to help, you know, teams with recommendations on the trade-offs between security and costs that are most appropriate for their user basis. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, certainly helpful. Curious to know what interoperability looks like between Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova. Is it easy to just go back and forth? Is it all part of the same ecosystem? I've never personally experienced using either, but yeah, would love to know more about that.
Sure. Both
so,
go ahead.
Yeah.
You'll be better at this one.
Okay. In the current implementations, it's basically you know, they both run on top of Ethereum, so they both have sort of direct native bridges to and from Ethereum. and that's what you're using. That's what you're directly using if you use our bridge user interface. So you can always sort of move things or transact by sort of going through Ethereum as the middleman. So Arbitrum went to Ethereum, back to Nova. Now, what this means is, there is, because it's an optimistic rollup on Arbitrum 1, there's a bit of a delay period there, which maybe isn't ideal. Now, what is also true, though, is, increasingly there's more and more, so there's many, many third-party bridges, other teams that have built applications that are on many chains, which include Arbitrum 1. Increasingly, these teams are also building on Arbitrum Nova. So bridging between Nova and 1 through a third-party bridge kind of feels like bridging between, any other two chains, L2 to L2, L2 to L1, and so on. There is more, so that's sort of the current state of things. Obviously, if you're using a third-party bridge, the security assumptions you're exposed to depends on the third-party bridge, so DYOR. We are thinking about, there's a bit more you can do here. We can take advantage of the fact that, not just that these are both Arbitrum chains using the same technology, but if we sort of are clever about it, the fact that they're using the same layer 1, we can make some of that UX a bit smoother. So that is something we're thinking about. But I should say, you should sort of think of them as two chains. They're their own kind of asynchronous environment. So that's sort of what makes layer 2s is that it's not going to be as directly composable as doing things on a single chain. This is, like I said, this general topic of bridging between chains, including between Ethereum and layer 2s and so on, is, I think, there's stuff that still can be done from a technical perspective, both by like L2 teams like us and also bridge teams. But I think from a like low level technical perspective, there's stuff that can be done. But I think the more important work is more like the UX stuff, which is also technical, of course, front end development. But wallets, block explorers, I think there's like a lot of room to do better there and room to expand and be creative about sort of abstracting away some of these pain points of having to think about multiple chains at once. So that's something I think if we fast forward like a year or maybe 2 years, there's no doubt in my mind that the experience of like being a multi-chain user of, blockchains will be completely different than it looks today. And that because there are a lot of smart teams working on this. But yeah, it's more of a UX challenge than anything else is sort of my takeaway.
Yeah, I think so too, Daniel. I think it'll get to a point where people don't even recognize that they're bridging anymore, at least in my opinion. I wanted to know if you guys had any plans, and I know that the way optimistic rollups work is that once you bridge over, you have to wait 7 days to bridge back. It's one of the reasons that I kind of held off in the past of bridging funds over, because I left that freedom of being able to bridge to another chain in case there's some sort of liquidity incentive, although those have mostly dried up. But curious to know if there's any developments in working around that 7-day waiting period.
Yeah, so it's at a protocol level, that's sort of this inherent property to optimistic rollups because we need time for validators to challenge. The key, the 7-day waiting period only happens if you're going from a layer 2 like Arbitrum 1 to a layer 1. The key thing to note here is that most of the time, if you're doing a smart contract thing on layer 2 and it has to make its way down to layer 1, that's probably a withdrawal of some assets, either ether or tokens. And there are, if you use a sort of fast exit bridge or a liquidity exit bridge, as we call them, you can bypass that waiting period. So a bunch of those bridges do exist, and our current, at one point we had thought about sort of setting up that infrastructure ourselves. We kind of settled on the fact that, hey, there's other teams fully focused on this. We like them. Let's let them do this. We have enough work to do, kind of thing. Our current sort of where we're at with this now is, again, we have our bridge user interface. You can do a slow withdrawal directly, or we just sort of link you to a bunch of others and say you can use these other bridges. The tricky thing here is reasoning about security of bridges is notoriously not simple. L2Beat has done a great job. A few months ago, I think at DevCon, they released their like bridge beat or L2 bridge or something. Their sort of security analysis and rankings and classifications of bridges. I think they did about as good of a job as you can do. And what they did is still pretty confusing, probably for the average user. So this is a tricky thing, how to communicate, what sort of risks are you being exposed to when you use one of these bridges? The most important thing, whatever, because I'm a protocol wonk, is like, what are the actual trust assumptions? The most important thing to me are what are the trust assumptions. It is totally possible to create trustless bridges. The ones that I like to name, because I'm, have confidence that they are indeed doing this, are Connext. So if you use Connext, you're not exposed to additional trust assumptions if you're just sort of moving assets. Hop, I think, that's fairly true. It's a little more complicated. But Hop is another one where they're sort of interacting with the core bridge contracts in this way that they're actually inheriting their trustlessness. Most other bridges you can't say that about. There's something else going on here. So yeah, it's a do your own research sort of situation. But that's kind of where we're at now. Is there are fast bridges? It's totally, these techniques have been known for a while, and right, we just sort of point users towards them.
One thing I'm going to add, and I'm not going to advocate for the use of centralized exchanges, but from an onboarding perspective, most of the major centralized exchanges have support for Arbitrum, at least in some capacity. So, for example, Binance, Coinbase, Kraken, Bybit, Crypto.com, and a slew of others all have support. For example, if you want to withdraw your ETH from Coinbase, and again, make sure you do it properly. Draw your ETH from Coinbase into Arbitrum, and you don't have to touch layer one at all. So you do have, from an onboarding perspective, the ability to get directly into Arbitrum much more seamlessly than you might have in the past. And Noah, you can bridge to Arbitrum and never leave. You feel free to just stick around.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
Right on, guys. I've always been curious to know why you didn't go the liquidity incentive or even native token route the way that Optimism and Metis did. Obviously, it's worked out for you just fine, but just always something I was wondering about.
Do you want to take something?
Yeah, sure.
I feel like you should go first, and then I'll say more.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to comment sort of on like liquidity mining incentives and strategies of others. I think that I'll just focus on what we've been focused on. From our perspective, the most important thing is to be able to just go ahead and build the best platform that developers want to use from a technical and community perspective, and that's the long-term moat. A lot of things can come and go, but if you have a product that people want to use, that will last, and that's how we've been doing it. And it's been amazing to see. We started, GMX is a great example, and it's really about hustle, being there for them, helping them grow and scale, and being a good partner in that process for them is the thing that liquidity mining incentives. If you look in historically how a lot of them have played out. There isn't a sense of stickiness, and we're really trying to build a community that is focused on building within Arbitrum because of the tech, because of the mission, and because of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I like to think it's actually it's something that we're very proud of, is how much the community's been able to grow, without these kind of direct incentives thrown at it. But I like to think it's sort of like a valuable thing for the whole space to see, that it just demonstrates, again, like AJ said, that there actually is demand to use this stuff, even if people, even if people aren't being directly incentivized to. So that I think is really cool that we've been able to come this far. Without a token, without token incentives, and for the most part without giving direct grants to project, with really just a few exceptions, but nothing compared to what especially some of the other L1s are doing. So yeah, I think again, this just kind of proves that there's demand to use this, and you don't need to pay people to use it when they actually want to. In terms of what I would also say in terms of like a native token, I don't know what exactly you have in mind there. But one thing that was never really one thing that was always off the table, our native token is ETH on Arbitrum chains. In part, that's because we don't have a token, obviously, but also, as sort of a piece of Ethereum alignment in general, we wanted to sort of use the Ether native currency, and also just as part of the sort of attitude of not introducing additional security assumptions or additional complications and things like that. This idea that like Arbitrum is really an extension of Ethereum. that, you know, using ETH as the coin which users use to pay fees, as the coin which validators use to stake, and things like that. Always just kind of made the most sense. Also, we don't have a token. I just want to make that clear. So it wasn't really an option.
No, I'm aware that you guys don't have a token. I was just curious and drawing that parallel. Okay, I got it. You were being
I wanted to make sure I wasn't giving a sense that there was a.
Oh no, got it. Yeah. No, I mean, you guys have answered all my questions thoroughly and given me and hopefully the audience members a better understanding of what Arbitrum has done up until this point, and your, you know, as much as you guys are able to reveal your vision for the future. So I really appreciate you coming on. I have a community member that has a question or maybe a few questions. If anyone else wants to come up and ask a couple questions, just shoot me a DM first so I know what you're asking, and then I can bring you up. But guys, anything that I missed or anything that we haven't discussed that you feel important to highlight?
Don't think so. Happy to take questions.
If you're interested in building an Arbitrum, feel free to reach out. We're here.
Oh yeah, that.
Okay, so say it. Go for it, man. Mike's yours.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. Okay, so you talked about Stylus, and I've also read in a Medium article that it will make Web3 games and social media platforms development easy than ever. So I was wondering, will Stylus act as a complete SDK for game developers as well? And will you also be integrating it with the Unity or Unreal Engine?
Interesting. I don't know about Unity or Unreal, getting to that. But in terms of what we'll be offering, as far as an SDK, like it will definitely be much more than just this kind of like low-level virtual machine support. We do want to make it sort of include the various layers that make it easier for developers to use, right? Because I mean, one of the interesting things about a world of Stylus is, you know, fairly advanced programmers, if they want to do this project, they could even start designing something like a new smart contract language if they were so inclined. But you know, so not only will like we be doing that, again, sort of making sure that there's at the very least Rust support, maybe a few others, but also sort of giving the relevant tooling between that and actually like working and deploying a contract. So that will be, yeah, there'll be some sort of Stylus SDK with client side stuff. Whether it directly supports gaming stuff, I don't know. But that's an interesting thing. I think we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But yeah, direct integration with Unity is not something I'd thought of. That's a fun idea.
Yeah.
One thing to
Awesome.
add, there are folks that have like forks of the Unity SDK already live on Arbitrum. So, for example, the Sequence wallet already allows you to use it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I was thinking that there is a possibility of valid transaction to be flagged as fraudulent by the fraud proof. So do you have any measures to prevent this?
Say that one more time. A fraudulent transaction. Yes, say that one more time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure, I can repeat that. So there is a possibility of valid transaction to be flagged as a fraudulent by the fraud proofs. So do you have any preventive measures for this?
Right. So basically, I think the way to think about this is for a given state update, you can think of it as an Arbitrum block. We call them R blocks. At any given point, the state transition is deterministic. So there is a valid final state, and then everything else is invalid. And that's really all you sort of need to know, right? So if a validator makes an assertion and says, you know, this is the next block, if it's valid, it's valid. If it's not, it's not. And essentially, if a challenge, you know, in the case where it's valid, people can challenge it. In the case where it's invalid, people can challenge it. The guarantee is that the honest party will win, right? So in your example, it is true. I can make a valid assertion and then some other annoying validator can challenge me. We can't prevent that. But the guarantee is that the valid side will win. And users, for the most part, even while this happens, don't really notice anything. The only slight the only effect a user could, you know, average user using Arbitrum, the only thing that they could feel is that their withdrawals, if they're withdrawing directly, could be delayed because we have to wait for this challenge to finish. But that's basically it. And even then they can use a fast bridge, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, understood. Okay, final question. You may have been asked this question many times. You must be familiar with the sharding, which is a multi-phase upgrade to improve Ethereum scalability and capacity. So I was thinking when this upgrade has been implemented, so what will it mean for Arbitrum?
Yeah, I mean, basically, sharding is, as you say, it's multi-phase. So it sort of depends on sort of how this plays out. What I can say is, as of October, Off-Chain Labs, the company, acquired the Prism team, which is, one of the major Ethereum Layer 1 consensus clients. And one of the things that they're doing is working on sort of the various steps, the groundwork for EIP 4844, blob data, things like that. So this will, what's cool about this is this helps rollups in general, all rollups, it helps them all equally. In terms of what this means for Arbitrum, I mean, the way Arbitrum is designed is it's sort of, the stack is already kind of agnostic to where the data comes from, because the tech stack is already designed to use, to run in sort of rollup mode and to run in Arbitrum Nova AnyTrust mode. So the blob data will mean, okay, we're getting data from a slightly different place. We may have to reconfigure things like that, but beyond that, everything kind of works the same way. So I don't expect there to be a lot of like technical overhead on the Arbitrum side when we introduce this blob data stuff. But again, we have the Prism team, so that's nice. And I should say this blob data 4844, that's kind of the first step on the way to something that's more like sharding. I don't know. Sharding, what we mean by sharding has sort of changed over the years, I guess. But what it actually means materially is cheaper call data, which means cheaper transactions for Arbitrum users. So we're happy about that.
Got it. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. Over to you now.
Thanks, Rahmat. Go for it. Hey, you had a question? And you have your hand up.
Hi, guys. I would like to share a song. I don't know if this is appropriate right now, but I just felt like coming in and sharing a song about the space. If you're okay with it.
Probably not the best time. It's going to kind of take us off of track. This is an ecosystem deep dive, so and I want to be cognizant of AJ and Daniel's time. But appreciate you coming on, Daniel, AJ. It's been a pleasure having you guys on today. I don't know if there's anything else left for us to discuss. You guys are always welcome back on our podium to share updates on Arbitrum or share exciting news about projects that you guys are building. And if you want to leave our audience with some final thoughts, or final words before you part today, then go ahead and do so now.
Nothing in particular, but yeah, thanks for having us. This was fun. And if you're still there, feel free to share your song on Discord. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right. Yep. Thank you, Whale Coin Talk community, for joining today. Remember that everything you hear on these broadcasts is meant for educational purposes only. Nothing is financial advice. Take care. Be safe out there. Bye-bye.
Cheers.